Lady Margaret Whitmore adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and studied the photograph spread across her mahogany desk with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient hieroglyphs. The image, taken at the Danish royal family's Christmas dinner 3 months earlier, appeared innocent enough to the casual observer. Elegant royals seated around a magnificent table, crystal glasses catching the soft candlelight, everyone smiling warmly for the camera. But Margaret saw something entirely different. She saw a conversation that had nothing to do with holiday pleasantries. The 62-year-old protocol expert had spent the last 3 decades of her life studying what she privately called the silent language, the intricate system of nonverbal communication that royal families had developed over centuries to convey messages without speaking a word. What had begun as casual observation during her early years working as a cultural attaché at the British Embassy in Copenhagen had evolved into an obsession that consumed every waking moment of her retirement. Margaret reached for her leather-bound notebook, one of 47 identical volumes that lined her study shelves, each filled with meticulous observations, hand-drawn diagrams, and carefully coded notes. She had developed her own system of documentation over the years, using symbols and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone else but allowed her to record the most sensitive information without fear of discovery. In the Danish Christmas photograph, Crown Prince Frederic's left hand rested casually on his water glass, his index finger extended precisely 2 inches down the stem. Margaret's heart raced as she recognized the signal. According to her research, this specific hand position indicated that the prince was conveying urgent concern about a family member's health information that was not yet public knowledge. But, which family member? The answer lay in the direction of his gaze. Margaret traced Frederic's line of sight with her finger across the photograph. His eyes were fixed not on his wife, Crown Princess Mary, nor on their children, but on his younger brother, Prince Joachim, who sat at the opposite end of the table. Joachim appeared relaxed and cheerful in the photo, raising his own glass in what seemed like a festive toast. However, Margaret noticed something that made her stomach tighten with concern. Prince Joachim's napkin was folded and placed beneath his bread plate rather than on his lap, where protocol dictated it should be during active dining. Margaret flipped frantically through her notebooks until she found the relevant entry from her observations of a Spanish royal wedding in 2019. The placement of a napkin beneath the bread plate was a distress signal, one that indicated the person was experiencing serious personal difficulties but was required to maintain public appearances. Margaret set down her magnifying glass and walked to the window of her cottage in the English countryside. The implications of what she was seeing in this single photograph were staggering. If her interpretations were correct, Crown Prince Frederick had been trying to communicate concerns about his brother's well-being to other family members at the dinner table, while Prince Joachim himself was silently crying out for help through his own carefully positioned table setting. This wasn't the first time Margaret had noticed patterns like this in royal photographs. Over the past year, she had documented an increasing frequency of distress signals among various European royal family members. The signals appeared in official portraits, candid photographs from state dinners, and even casual family snapshots shared on social media accounts. Something was happening within the highest circles of European nobility, and Margaret was beginning to suspect she was the only person outside those circles who understood the scope of it. Margaret's journey into royal protocol began innocently enough in 1993 when she was assigned to assist with arrangements for a state visit by the Danish royal family to London. As a young cultural attaché fresh out of Oxford with degrees in European history and linguistics, she was thrilled to be working so closely with genuine royalty. Her job was to ensure that every detail of the visit proceeded according to centuries-old protocols that governed interactions between royal houses. During her first formal dinner with the Danish delegation, Margaret noticed something odd. Queen Margrethe II seemed to be having 2 entirely different conversations simultaneously. Verbally, she engaged in pleasant small talk about British architecture and the weather. But her hands told a completely different story. Throughout the meal, the Queen's fingers moved in subtle patterns, touching her earring, adjusting her bracelet, repositioning her utensils in ways that seemed too deliberate to be unconscious gestures. Margaret watched in fascination as other members of the Danish royal party appeared to respond to these hand movements with equally subtle signals of their own. A slight nod here, a specific way of holding a wineglass there, the precise angle at which someone placed their fork on their plate, it was as if an entirely separate conversation was taking place in a language Margaret didn't understand. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed at the embassy staff quarters, replaying every moment of the dinner in her mind. She had always been observant by nature, a trait that had served her well in her diplomatic training, but this felt different. It was as if she had glimpsed something secret and significant, a hidden layer of royal life that existed beneath the surface of public ceremonies and official protocols. The next morning, Margaret approached her supervisor, Ambassador Sir Richard Thornbury, with her observations. Sir Richard, a distinguished gentleman who had served in diplomatic posts across Europe for over 30 years, listened politely but seemed unimpressed by Margaret's theories. "My dear Margaret," he said with a patronizing smile, "I'm afraid you're reading far too much into perfectly normal social behaviors. These are highly educated, sophisticated people who have been trained from birth in proper etiquette. What you're interpreting as secret signals are simply the refined mannerisms of individuals who have spent their entire lives in formal social situations." Margaret nodded politely but wasn't convinced. That evening, during the state banquet at Buckingham Palace, she positioned herself where she could observe both the Danish royal family and their British hosts throughout the meal. What she witnessed that night changed the course of her life forever. The banquet proceeded with flawless precision. Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Margrethe II exchanged warm toasts, praising the strong bonds between their two nations. Prince Philip charmed the Danish delegation with amusing anecdotes about his own Danish heritage. The conversation flowed smoothly from topic to topic: trade relations, environmental initiatives, cultural exchanges. But, underneath this diplomatic ballet, Margaret detected a completely different drama unfolding. Early in the meal, she noticed that Queen Elizabeth briefly touched the rim of her water glass with her right index finger while looking directly at Crown Prince Frederick. Within minutes, Frederick had quietly adjusted his position in his chair and nodded almost imperceptibly toward his mother, Queen Margrethe. Margaret began sketching what she was seeing, creating rough diagrams of the hand positions and noting the timing of each gesture. As the evening progressed, she documented what appeared to be an elaborate nonverbal exchange involving multiple members of both royal families. The British royals seemed to be conveying information about upcoming political developments, while the Danish royals responded with their own coded messages about European Union negotiations. The most striking moment came during the dessert course. Prince Philip placed his dessert spoon parallel to his coffee cup and looked meaningfully at Crown Prince Frederick. Frederick immediately excused himself from the table for several minutes. When he returned, he positioned his own utensils in a specific pattern that seemed to provide some kind of confirmation or response to Philip's signal. Margaret realized she was witnessing something extraordinary: a sophisticated communication system that allowed royal families to discuss sensitive political and personal matters in public without anyone understanding what was really being said. The implications were staggering. How many historical events had been influenced by conversations that took place not through words but through subtle gestures and carefully positioned objects? After the Danish delegation departed London, Margaret threw herself into research with an intensity that surprised even her. She spent countless hours in the British Museum's archives, searching through historical accounts of royal gatherings for any mention of unusual behavioral patterns or mysterious communication methods. She studied paintings of medieval banquets, looking for clues about how noble families might have communicated secretly in crowded halls filled with potential enemies and spies. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a collection of letters between Queen Victoria and her daughter, the Crown Princess of Prussia, housed in the royal archives. The letters, written in the 1870s, contained several cryptic references to the old ways and silent speech that nobility used during formal gatherings. One letter in particular caught Margaret's attention. "My dearest Vicky," Queen Victoria had written to her daughter, "I was pleased to observe that you have mastered the silent speech so thoroughly. Your message during last week's state dinner regarding the Prussian minister's intentions was received clearly, though I confess the matter requires delicate handling. Remember that the placement of the salt cellar is reserved for matters of utmost urgency, and should never be used lightly." Margaret stared at the letter in amazement. Here was proof that royal families had indeed developed sophisticated nonverbal communication systems. The reference to salt cellar placement suggested that even the arrangement of table objects carried specific meanings. Margaret began to understand that what she had witnessed at the Danish state dinner was not a modern innovation but, rather, the continuation of a tradition that stretched back centuries. Over the following months, Margaret used her position at the embassy to attend as many royal functions as possible. She volunteered for every assignment that brought her into contact with European nobility, always carrying a small notebook where she discreetly recorded her observations. She developed her own shorthand system for documenting hand gestures, facial expressions, and object placements, creating what would eventually become a comprehensive catalogue of royal nonverbal communication. Margaret's colleagues began to view her with a mixture of amusement and concern. She had always been a dedicated employee, but her new obsession with royal behavior seemed excessive even by diplomatic standards. Some whispered that the pressure of working at such high levels of government had affected her judgment. Others suggested she was simply seeking attention by manufacturing mysteries where none existed. But Margaret didn't care about office gossip. She was discovering something remarkable, something that no scholar or historian had ever properly documented. Each royal gathering she attended added new pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle. She learned that different royal houses had their own variations of the silent language, but that certain fundamental signals appeared to be universal across European nobility. A raised eyebrow while touching a wineglass meant disagreement with whatever was being discussed verbally. The specific way someone folded their napkin could indicate everything from romantic interest to political alliance to imminent departure. The placement of utensils conveyed information about family dynamics, health concerns, and even succession issues. Margaret's most significant discovery came during a wedding celebration for a minor Swedish royal. She noticed that the bride's grandmother, an elderly duchess, kept repositioning her pearl necklace throughout the ceremony. At first, Margaret assumed it was simple nervousness or discomfort. But, when she compared her notes from this event with similar observations from other weddings, she realized the duchess was sending a very specific message. The pearl necklace movements followed a precise pattern: 3 touches to the clasp, followed by a gentle adjustment of the central pearls, then, a final touch to the left side of the strand. Margaret had seen this exact sequence at 2 other royal weddings, each time performed by an elderly female relative of the bride. After careful analysis, she concluded that this was a traditional blessing signal, a way for senior women in royal families to give their approval to marriage unions without speaking the words aloud. This revelation opened up entirely new avenues of research for Margaret. She began to understand that the silent language encompassed not just political and social communication but also deeply personal and spiritual elements of royal life. There were signals for blessing and cursing, for expressing love and disappointment, for conveying warnings about dangers that couldn't be spoken aloud in public. As Margaret's expertise grew, so did her reputation within certain circles. Other embassy staff members began consulting her when they needed to interpret unusual behavior at diplomatic functions. She was quietly asked to brief senior diplomats on the likely meanings of gestures they had observed during high-level meetings. Margaret realized she was becoming an unofficial expert in a field that had never been formally studied or acknowledged. However, Margaret's growing knowledge came with an unexpected burden. The more she understood about royal nonverbal communication, the more she realized how much private information was being shared openly at public events. She was essentially eavesdropping on conversations that were meant to be secret, learning about family problems, political strategies, and personal relationships that royals assumed were safely hidden from public view. The ethical implications troubled her deeply. Did she have a right to decode these private communications? Should she be documenting information that royal families clearly intended to keep secret? Margaret struggled with these questions as her notebooks filled with increasingly sensitive observations about the private lives of some of Europe's most powerful families. Margaret's moral dilemma reached a breaking point during the summer of 1998 at a garden party hosted by the Belgian royal family. She had been invited as part of a cultural exchange program and was observing the event from her usual position near the refreshment tables, where she could watch the interactions of multiple royal family members simultaneously. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful. King Albert II moved graciously among his guests, engaging in light conversation about Belgium's upcoming EU presidency. Queen Paula charmed a group of diplomats with stories about her recent charity work. Crown Prince Philippe and his new wife Mathilde appeared blissfully happy as they mingled with younger guests. But Margaret's trained eye caught something disturbing. Throughout the afternoon, she noticed that Crown Prince Philippe repeatedly performed a specific gesture, touching his watch face with his left index finger while looking directly at his father, King Albert. Margaret recognized this signal from her notes as an urgent request for private consultation. However, King Albert seemed to be deliberately ignoring his son's attempts to communicate. As the party progressed, Philippe's signals became more frequent and more obvious. He began incorporating additional gestures that Margaret knew indicated extreme distress. He positioned his champagne glass at precise angles that conveyed mounting anxiety. He adjusted his tie in a pattern that Margaret had documented as a plea for immediate family assistance. The situation escalated when Queen Paula joined the silent conversation. Margaret watched in fascination as the Queen began her own series of subtle signals directed at her husband. She touched her pearl earrings in a specific sequence that Margaret recognized as a warning about potential scandal. She repositioned her handbag 3 times in 5 minutes, each movement indicating increased urgency. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. She was witnessing what appeared to be a family crisis unfolding in real time, communicated entirely through gestures that she was probably the only non-family member present who could understand. The ethical weight of this knowledge felt overwhelming. Her internal struggle was interrupted when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. King Albert had finally acknowledged his family's signals, but his response was deeply troubling. He placed his hand over his heart in a gesture that Margaret had never seen before, but somehow instinctively understood as a sign of profound disappointment or rejection. The immediate aftermath was subtle but dramatic. Crown Prince Philippe excused himself from the party within minutes of his father's final signal. Queen Paula remained but became visibly tense, her smile never quite reaching her eyes for the remainder of the afternoon. King Albert continued to play the gracious host, but Margaret noticed his hands shaking slightly as he raised his glass for a toast. That night, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She could not continue documenting these private family moments without the subjects knowing they were being observed and interpreted. The silent language was clearly meant to be a private form of communication, and she was violating that privacy simply by understanding it. Margaret decided to approach Queen Paula directly the following morning before leaving Belgium. It was an unprecedented breach of diplomatic protocol, but Margaret felt she had no choice. She requested a brief private audience through official channels, citing her academic interest in royal customs and traditions. To Margaret's surprise, Queen Paula agreed to meet with her in a small sitting room at the royal residence. The Queen appeared curious rather than concerned as Margaret carefully explained her background in protocol studies and her accidental discovery of royal nonverbal communication systems. "Your Majesty," Margaret said nervously, "I want to assure you that I have never shared my observations with anyone, and I never would. But I felt you should know that someone outside your family has inadvertently learned to interpret your private communications." Queen Paula studied Margaret for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Margaret's amazement, the Queen smiled warmly and invited her to sit down. "My dear," Queen Paula said in her cultured voice, "you have discovered something that our families have been wondering about for years. We have all suspected that someone with sufficient observation skills and historical knowledge might eventually decode our traditional communications. We have simply been waiting to see who it would be." Margaret sat in stunned silence as Queen Paula continued. "The silent language, as you call it, has been passed down through European royal families for over 8 centuries. It developed during medieval times when noble families needed ways to communicate sensitive information in the presence of potential enemies or spies. Over the generations, it evolved into a sophisticated system that allows us to discuss matters that would be inappropriate or dangerous to voice aloud in public settings." The Queen explained that different royal houses had developed their own variations of the basic signals, but that certain fundamental gestures remained consistent across all European nobility. The system was taught to royal children from an early age, usually by elder family members who had mastered its subtleties over decades of practice. "What you witnessed yesterday," Queen Paula said gently, "was indeed a family discussion about a sensitive matter. My son was seeking guidance about a personal decision that could affect his future role. My husband's response, while perhaps harsh in its finality, was necessary to maintain certain boundaries." Margaret felt both relieved and overwhelmed by this confirmation of her theories. Queen Paula seemed to understand her emotional state and offered additional insights that would prove invaluable to Margaret's continued research. "If you wish to continue studying our communications," the Queen said, "I would suggest you approach it as a cultural historian rather than as an outside observer. These signals represent a living tradition that connects modern royal families to our medieval ancestors. There is real value in documenting this heritage before it is lost to changing times." Queen Paula provided Margaret with contact information for several other royal family members who might be willing to share information about the silent language traditions. She also warned Margaret about the political sensitivities involved in her research. "You must understand," the Queen emphasized, "that knowledge of our communication methods could be dangerous in the wrong hands. There are those who would use this information to manipulate royal families or to misinterpret our private discussions for political gain. We trust you because you have proven your discretion, but this trust comes with serious responsibilities." Margaret left Belgium with a new sense of purpose and a much clearer understanding of the ethical dimensions of her work. She was no longer simply observing interesting behavioral patterns, she was documenting a cultural heritage that royal families themselves wanted preserved and studied by qualified scholars. Over the following years, Margaret developed relationships with protocol experts and historians within several European royal households. She learned that there was actually significant interest among royal family members in having their communication traditions properly documented, since the knowledge was becoming increasingly fragmented as older generations passed away. Margaret's research took on new dimensions as she gained access to historical documents and family archives that had previously been unavailable to outside scholars. She discovered references to the silent language in court records dating back to the 13th century, including detailed descriptions of specific signals used during important political negotiations. One particularly fascinating discovery came from the archives of the French royal family, where Margaret found a training manual written in 1647 that provided instruction in the discreet arts of silent discourse. The manual included illustrations showing proper hand positions for various types of communication, along with warnings about the consequences of misusing or revealing the sacred knowledge. Margaret learned that the silent language had played crucial roles in some of the most significant events in European history. During the Congress of Vienna in 1815, royal family members had used nonverbal signals to coordinate their responses to Napoleon's final defeat. The communication system had been essential during both world wars, when royal families needed ways to share information that couldn't risk being intercepted by enemy intelligence services. As Margaret's expertise grew, she began receiving invitations to serve as an unofficial consultant for important royal events. Her role was never formally acknowledged, but she was often positioned where she could observe and interpret family communications that might affect the proceedings. Royal households wanted someone present who could recognize when private family discussions were influencing public ceremonies. One of Margaret's most significant contributions came during the wedding negotiations for a Scandinavian prince in 2003. The bride's family was from a different cultural background and was unfamiliar with traditional European royal communication methods. Margaret quietly provided guidance that helped prevent several potential misunderstandings that could have created diplomatic incidents. However, Margaret's growing involvement with royal families also exposed her to increasingly complex political dynamics. She began to understand that the silent language was not just a charming historical tradition but an active tool used to navigate modern international relations. Royal families regularly shared information about government policies, economic developments, and social issues through their nonverbal communications. Margaret realized she was becoming privy to information that was essentially state secrets shared between allied nations. The burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on her conscience. She was a scholar and cultural attaché, not a spy or political operative, yet she found herself in possession of sensitive intelligence simply by virtue of understanding how royal families communicated with each other. The situation became even more complicated when Margaret began noticing patterns in royal communications that suggested coordination of positions on major international issues. During a series of state dinners in 2004, she observed European royal family members sharing signals that appeared to relate to their nation's upcoming votes on controversial European Union policies. Margaret documented these observations but struggled with whether she should report them to her superiors at the British Foreign Office. The information could be valuable for British diplomatic strategies, but sharing it would violate the trust that royal families had placed in her. She found herself caught between her loyalty to her government and her commitment to protecting the privacy of the families who had welcomed her into their confidential world. The dilemma intensified when Margaret noticed that British royal family members were also participating in these coordinated communications. During a state visit by German officials, she observed Prince Philip and Prince Charles sharing signals with their German counterparts that seemed to relate to upcoming trade negotiations. Margaret realized that British royals were using the silent language to discuss matters that could affect British government policies. Margaret spent sleepless nights wrestling with the implications of what she was seeing. Was she witnessing inappropriate royal interference in government affairs, or simply the natural result of royal families' unique position in international diplomacy? Were these communications helpful supplements to official government channels, or potentially dangerous bypasses of democratic oversight? Her confusion deepened when she discovered that various European governments were actually aware of their royal family's communication activities and sometimes relied on information gathered through these channels. Margaret learned that the silent language served as a kind of informal diplomatic network that allowed friendly nations to share sensitive information without creating official records. The system worked because royal family members could interact socially at events where government officials might not be welcome. They could discuss delicate topics without creating transcripts or recordings that might later prove politically embarrassing. The nonverbal nature of their communications provided plausible deniability if questions were ever raised about what had been discussed. Margaret began to understand that she had stumbled into a world where the boundaries between cultural tradition, family privacy, and international diplomacy were deliberately blurred. The silent language was simultaneously a charming historical heritage, a private family communication system, and an active tool of modern statecraft. This realization forced Margaret to reconsider the entire foundation of her research. Was she studying historical customs or contemporary intelligence operations? Were royal families preserving cultural traditions or engaging in sophisticated political coordination? The answers seemed to depend on perspective and context in ways that made simple scholarly analysis impossible. As Margaret grappled with these questions, she continued documenting her observations but became increasingly selective about what information she recorded and how she stored it. She developed elaborate coding systems that would protect the privacy of royal family communications even if her research materials were ever discovered by unauthorized persons. She also began limiting her research to historical aspects of the silent language rather than contemporary applications. Margaret's careful balance between scholarly research and political discretion was shattered in the autumn of 2007 when she witnessed something that would haunt her for years to come. She was attending a cultural exchange dinner in Stockholm, representing the British Embassy at what was supposed to be a routine social gathering with minor Swedish royal family members and various international guests. The evening began pleasantly enough. Margaret positioned herself at her usual observation point, planning to focus on documenting historical aspects of Swedish royal communication traditions rather than contemporary political discussions. She had brought along a camera to photograph some antique table settings that illustrated traditional Swedish royal dining customs. As the dinner progressed, Margaret noticed increasing tension among the Swedish royal family members present. Prince Carl Philip appeared agitated, repeatedly performing hand gestures that Margaret recognized as urgent requests for private consultation with his elder sister, Crown Princess Victoria. However, Victoria seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact with her brother, a response that Margaret knew indicated serious disagreement or disapproval. The situation escalated when Prince Carl Philip began using more dramatic signals. He positioned his wineglass and utensils in patterns that Margaret had documented as indicating family crisis. He touched his collar in a specific sequence that conveyed desperate need for assistance. Most alarming of all, he began incorporating gestures that Margaret had only seen described in historical documents, emergency signals that were supposedly reserved for matters involving physical danger or threats to royal succession. Margaret felt increasingly uncomfortable as she realized she was witnessing a genuine family emergency playing out through the silent language. She considered excusing herself from the dinner, but before she could leave, the situation took an even more dramatic turn. Crown Princess Victoria finally acknowledged her brother's signals, but her response was unlike anything Margaret had ever observed. Victoria performed a complex sequence of hand movements that seemed to combine several different types of communication. She touched her necklace in a pattern that indicated family shame, positioned her napkin in a way that suggested permanent rejection, and concluded with a gesture that Margaret recognized from medieval documents as a formal severing of family bonds. The immediate aftermath was devastating to watch. Prince Carl Philip's face went completely pale, and his hands began shaking visibly. He attempted several more desperate signals, but Victoria refused to acknowledge them. Other family members at the table became increasingly tense as they recognized what was happening, though the non-royal guests remained oblivious to the family drama unfolding before them. Margaret documented the entire exchange in her notebook, but she felt sick doing so. She was witnessing the destruction of family relationships through a communication system that was supposed to maintain discretion and dignity. The silent language, which had always seemed elegant and sophisticated in Margaret's previous observations, suddenly appeared cruel and cold when used to deliver such devastating personal messages. The dinner concluded with polite formalities, but Margaret could see that Prince Carl Philip was barely maintaining his composure. She noticed him making subtle signals toward other family members that she interpreted as pleas for intervention or support, but he received only silence in return. By the end of the evening, Margaret realized she had witnessed a complete breakdown in family communication that had left one royal family member totally isolated. Margaret spent the following days researching similar incidents in historical records. She discovered that the silent language had indeed been used throughout history to communicate family rejections and succession disputes. Medieval documents described elaborate non-verbal ceremonies where royal family members were formally excluded from inheritance lines through specific gesture sequences. However, Margaret also learned that these extreme uses of the silent language were supposed to be accompanied by private family discussions and formal written documentation. The public nature of what she had witnessed in Stockholm suggested that normal family communication channels had completely broken down, forcing the dispute into the realm of public ceremony. Margaret's research into the Stockholm incident led her to contact several European royal history experts who confirmed her worst suspicions. Prince Carl Philip was indeed facing serious personal difficulties related to his romantic relationships and career choices. The family disagreement that Margaret had witnessed was part of a larger crisis that would eventually lead to significant changes in Swedish royal succession policies. More troubling to Margaret was the realization that her presence at the dinner had been specifically requested by Swedish court officials. She learned that royal families sometimes invited qualified observers to witness important family communications, essentially using independent documentation to create unofficial records of significant decisions. Margaret felt manipulated and betrayed by this discovery. She had thought she was attending a routine cultural exchange, but instead she had been positioned to serve as an unwitting witness to a family crisis. The Swedish royal household had essentially used her expertise to document a private family matter without her knowledge or consent. This incident forced Margaret to completely re-evaluate her relationship with the royal family she had been studying. She began to suspect that her research had been guided and controlled more than she had realized. Royal family members who had seemed so willing to share information about their communication traditions might have had ulterior motives related to creating documentation of their private discussions. Margaret spent months reviewing her previous research with new skepticism. She looked for patterns that might indicate when royal families had deliberately exposed their communications to her observation. She discovered several instances where family members had performed unusually obvious signals during events she attended, almost as if they wanted to ensure their messages were documented by an outside observer. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized she might have been functioning as an unofficial record keeper for royal family decisions that couldn't be documented through normal channels. Her scholarly research had unknowingly served as a backup communication system that royal families could reference if disputes arose about what had actually been communicated during private gatherings. Margaret's growing paranoia was confirmed when she received an unexpected visit from a representative of the Swedish royal court in early 2008. The official, who introduced himself as a cultural heritage specialist, politely requested copies of Margaret's observations from the Stockholm dinner. He explained that the royal family was conducting an internal review of family communication protocols and needed independent documentation of recent interactions. Margaret refused the request, citing academic independence and privacy concerns. However, the encounter made her realize that royal families viewed her research very differently than she had understood. To them, she was not just a scholar studying historical traditions but a practical resource who could provide objective documentation of contemporary family communications. This revelation led Margaret to make a difficult decision. She announced her retirement from active royal protocol research and began focusing exclusively on historical documentation. She would no longer attend contemporary royal events or document modern uses of the silent language. Her future work would concentrate on preserving the historical record of royal communication traditions without becoming involved in their current applications. However, Margaret's withdrawal from contemporary research did not end her involvement with royal family affairs. Over the following years, she received numerous requests from various royal households asking her to serve as a consultant on historical precedents for current communication challenges. Royal families were facing new situations that had no clear precedents in traditional silent language protocols, and they wanted expert guidance on how to adapt ancient traditions to modern circumstances. Margaret found herself in the unique position of helping royal families modernize their communication systems while maintaining historical authenticity. She developed new signal variations that could address contemporary issues like media management, social media protocols, and international human rights concerns. Her work during this period essentially became an active contribution to the evolution of royal communication traditions. One of Margaret's most significant contributions involved developing protocols for royal family communications during major international crises. The 2008 financial crisis created situations where European royal families needed to coordinate their public responses while maintaining appropriate political neutrality. Margaret helped design communication systems that allowed royal families to share information about economic impacts without appearing to influence government policies. Margaret also worked on adapting traditional silent language protocols for modern security concerns. Royal families were increasingly worried about surveillance technologies that might detect their private communications. Margaret developed modified gesture systems that would be virtually undetectable to electronic monitoring while maintaining the essential functions of traditional royal communication. These modernization efforts brought Margaret into contact with government security agencies that were responsible for protecting royal families. She learned that intelligence services had been aware of royal communication traditions for decades but had generally respected their privacy as long as the communications didn't threaten national security interests. However, the intersection of royal communications with international diplomacy and economic policy was creating new challenges for security agencies. Margaret found herself briefing government officials on the potential implications of royal family signals that might affect market confidence or international negotiations. Margaret's expertise became particularly valuable during major international summits where multiple royal families were present. Government officials wanted to understand whether royal family communications were reinforcing official diplomatic positions or potentially undermining them. Margaret helped develop protocols that ensured royal family members understood when their traditional communications might create unintended political consequences. The complexity of these arrangements troubled Margaret deeply. She had entered royal protocol research as an academic pursuit interested in preserving cultural heritage. Instead, she found herself functioning as a bridge between ancient traditions and modern statecraft, helping powerful families navigate the intersection of private communication and public policy. Margaret began to question whether the silent language could or should survive in the modern world. The communication system had developed during medieval times when royal families wielded direct political power and needed private channels for coordination. In contemporary democratic societies, the existence of secret royal communications raised questions about transparency and accountability that had no easy answers. Margaret's doubts intensified when she realized that younger members of royal families were increasingly reluctant to learn traditional communication methods. Many felt that the silent language was an outdated tradition that created unnecessary complications in their public roles. Some worried that secret communications were incompatible with modern expectations for royal transparency and accessibility. Margaret found herself documenting what might be the final generation of royal family members who fully mastered the traditional silent language. Younger royals were developing simplified communication systems that focused on basic coordination during public events rather than comprehensive family and political discussions. This generational transition created preservation challenges that Margaret had never anticipated. Should she focus on documenting traditional methods that were disappearing, or should she help develop new systems that better served contemporary royal families? The answer seemed to depend on whether royal families themselves wanted to maintain their communication traditions or were ready to abandon them entirely. Margaret's research had evolved from academic curiosity to cultural preservation to active participation in the transformation of royal communication systems. She realized that her work was not just documenting history but actively shaping the future of royal family traditions. The responsibility was both exciting and terrifying, as her decisions would influence how these ancient practices adapted to an increasingly complex modern world. Margaret's role as a bridge between traditional royal communications and modern requirements reached its most challenging phase in 2011 when she received an unprecedented request from multiple European royal families simultaneously. The occasion was the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton, an event that would bring together royalty from across Europe in the most watched royal gathering in decades. The challenge was unique in Margaret's experience. Royal families were concerned that their traditional silent language communications might be detected and misinterpreted by the intense media coverage surrounding the wedding. High-definition cameras, telephoto lenses, and detail photography would capture every gesture and facial expression during the ceremony and reception. Any unusual hand movements or object placements could trigger speculation about hidden meanings or family tensions. At the same time, the royal families attending the wedding had legitimate needs to communicate privately during the extended celebrations. There were complex protocols to coordinate, family dynamics to manage, and sensitive political discussions that couldn't wait for private meetings. The silent language had always served these purposes, but never under such intense public scrutiny. Margaret spent months developing what she privately called the Invisible Protocols, a modified communication system that would allow royal families to maintain their traditional functions while appearing completely natural to outside observers. The challenge was creating signals that looked like ordinary social behaviors but carried specific meanings for those trained to recognize them. Margaret's solution involved embedding communication signals within accepted social customs that were already expected at formal events. Instead of relying on unusual gestures that might attract attention, the new system used variations in timing, sequence, and combination of normal behaviors to convey different messages. For example, traditional handshaking became a communication method based on duration and pressure rather than unusual hand positions. A handshake held for exactly 3 seconds indicated polite acknowledgement, while 4 seconds conveyed agreement with a previously discussed topic. 5 seconds signaled urgent need for private consultation. The system was virtually undetectable to casual observers but provided royal family members with essential communication capabilities. Margaret worked with each royal household separately to ensure their delegates understood the modified protocols. She created detailed training materials that looked like standard etiquette guides but actually contained comprehensive communication instructions. The guides were designed to be indistinguishable from normal wedding preparation documents, providing perfect cover for the specialized training. The most complex aspect of Margaret's preparation involved coordinating between different royal houses that had their own traditional communication systems. European royal families had developed distinct variations of the silent language over centuries, and these differences could create misunderstandings during international gatherings. Margaret had to create translation guides that allowed royal families to understand each other's modified signals. Margaret's work during this period brought her into closer contact with government security agencies than ever before. Intelligence services were concerned that foreign agents might attempt to infiltrate royal communications or use the wedding as an opportunity to gather information about European political coordination. Margaret had to ensure that her communication systems couldn't be exploited by hostile intelligence services. The security briefings revealed the extent to which government agencies monitored royal communications. Margaret learned that intelligence services had developed sophisticated programs for analyzing royal family interactions, looking for patterns that might indicate coordination on sensitive political issues. Her modified protocols had to avoid triggering these surveillance systems while maintaining their communication functions. Margaret also discovered that some government officials were frustrated by their inability to monitor royal communications effectively. They worried that royal families might be conducting unauthorized diplomatic discussions or sharing information that could affect government policies. Margaret found herself caught between royal families who wanted private communication capabilities and security agencies who wanted transparency. The tension reached a peak when Margaret learned that several intelligence agencies had requested access to her research materials. Government officials argued that understanding royal communication methods was essential for national security purposes. They wanted to ensure that foreign royal families weren't using secret communications to influence British government policies or gather intelligence about British decision-making processes. Margaret refused these requests, citing her commitments to the royal families who had shared information with her. However, she realized that her position was becoming increasingly untenable. She was essentially protecting a communication system that government agencies viewed as a potential security threat, while helping royal families maintain capabilities that those same agencies wanted to monitor. The situation was complicated by the fact that British royal family members were also using the communication systems Margaret had helped develop. Margaret found herself in the bizarre position of protecting British royals' communication privacy from their own government's intelligence services. The ethical and political implications were staggering. Margaret's dilemma deepened when she realized that her modified communication protocols were actually more secure than traditional royal signals. The historical silent language had been developed during medieval times when the primary threats were political enemies and court spies. Modern surveillance technologies and intelligence analysis methods could easily detect and interpret traditional royal communications. Margaret's updated systems, however, were specifically designed to avoid detection by contemporary surveillance methods. The signals were embedded within normal social behaviors and varied in patterns that appeared random to automated analysis systems. Margaret had inadvertently created communication methods that were more secure than anything royal families had used in centuries. This realization led Margaret to understand that her research had evolved far beyond academic scholarship. She was essentially functioning as a security consultant, helping royal families protect their communications from government surveillance. The implications were troubling, as Margaret had never intended to work in opposition to her own government's intelligence interests. The William and Catherine wedding provided a real-world test of Margaret's modified communication systems. She attended the reception as part of the cultural exchange delegation, positioned where she could observe the interactions between different royal family members and assess whether her protocols were functioning effectively. The event was a remarkable success from Margaret's perspective. Royal family members seamlessly conducted complex communications throughout the celebration without attracting any media attention or security concern. Traditional family discussions, political coordination, and personal messages were exchanged through modified signals that appeared to be nothing more than elegant social behaviors. Margaret documented several specific examples of successful communication during the wedding reception. She observed Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark coordinating with Prince Felipe of Spain about upcoming European Union negotiations through a series of perfectly natural conversational gestures. She watched Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands convey complex information about economic policies to multiple royal family members through variations in her responses to formal introductions. Most impressively, Margaret witnessed British royal family members using her modified protocols to manage family dynamics during the highly stressful public event. Prince Philip coordinated seating arrangements and timing issues with Prince Charles through subtle communications that looked like ordinary grandfather-to-son interactions but actually contained detailed logistical instructions. The wedding's success convinced Margaret that royal communication traditions could indeed adapt to modern requirements without losing their essential functions. However, it also demonstrated the increasing sophistication required to maintain these capabilities in contemporary security environments. Margaret realized that royal families would need ongoing technical support to keep their communication systems ahead of advancing surveillance technologies. Over the following months, Margaret received numerous requests from royal families asking her to update their communication protocols for other high-profile events. She developed specialized systems for state dinners, international summits, and family celebrations, each tailored to the specific security and media environments of different occasions. Margaret's work during this period established her as the leading expert in secure royal communications, but it also isolated her from traditional academic communities. Her research was increasingly classified and couldn't be shared with other scholars. She was working on practical applications rather than theoretical studies, and her findings were considered too sensitive for academic publication. The isolation was compounded by Margaret's growing awareness of the political implications of her work. She was helping royal families maintain communication capabilities that were potentially at odds with democratic transparency expectations. The ancient traditions she was preserving were designed to allow aristocratic families to coordinate their activities without public oversight, a function that seemed increasingly problematic in modern democratic societies. Margaret began questioning whether her work was serving legitimate cultural preservation purposes or was simply helping powerful families maintain privileged communication channels that ordinary citizens couldn't access or monitor. The ethical dimensions of her research had become far more complex than anything she had anticipated when she first noticed unusual gestures at a Danish state dinner decades earlier. Her doubts were intensified by changes in the international political environment. Rising nationalism and populist movements across Europe were creating new suspicions about royal family involvement in political affairs. Margaret's communication systems could potentially be seen as tools that allowed royal families to coordinate responses to democratic movements without public knowledge or accountability. Margaret also noticed that her modified communication protocols were being adapted for uses she had never intended. Some royal family members were using the systems to conduct business discussions that skirted ethics regulations about royal commercial activities. Others were coordinating political positions in ways that might violate constitutional restrictions on royal involvement in government affairs. These developments forced Margaret to confront fundamental questions about the role of royal communications in modern society. Were the traditions she was preserving valuable cultural heritage that deserved protection, or were they outdated privileges that had no place in contemporary democratic systems? Should royal families have access to private communication methods that weren't available to other citizens, or did transparency requirements apply equally to all public figures? Margaret realized that her research had reached a crossroads. She could continue developing increasingly sophisticated communication systems that helped royal families maintain their traditional privileges, or she could shift toward promoting transparency and democratic accountability in royal communications. The choice would determine not just the direction of her work but the future of royal communication traditions themselves. The decision was complicated by Margaret's personal relationships with royal family members who had become genuinely supportive of her work. She had developed friendships with people who trusted her to protect their privacy and preserve their cultural heritage. Abandoning her research would feel like betraying individuals who had opened their private world to academic study. At the same time, Margaret felt increasing pressure from democratic institutions that were questioning the appropriateness of secret royal communications. Parliamentary committees, media organizations, and civil rights groups were beginning to ask whether royal families should have access to communication methods that weren't transparent to public oversight. Margaret's expertise was being sought by those who wanted to understand and, potentially, regulate royal communication activities. Margaret's moment of truth came in the winter of 2015 when she received a phone call that would force her to choose between loyalty and principle. The caller was Dr. Helena Richardson, an investigative journalist from the Guardian newspaper who had spent months researching connections between European royal families and controversial political developments across the continent. Professor Whitmore, Dr. Richardson said during their initial conversation, "I believe you possess information that could shed light on how European royal families have been coordinating their responses to the refugee crisis, Brexit negotiations, and the rise of populist movements. The public has a right to understand whether royal families are using secret communications to influence democratic processes." Margaret felt her stomach tighten as Dr. Richardson continued. The journalist had clearly done extensive research into Margaret's background and understood the significance of her work on royal communications. Dr. Richardson explained that she had evidence suggesting royal families were using nonverbal communication systems to coordinate political positions that might be inappropriate for constitutional monarchies. "I'm not asking you to betray confidences, Dr. Richardson assured Margaret, "but I am asking you to consider whether the public interest requires transparency about communication methods that could affect democratic governance. These families hold significant influence over government policies, and if they're coordinating that influence through secret channels, citizens deserve to know." Margaret spent sleepless nights wrestling with Dr. Richardson's arguments. The journalist was asking fundamental questions about accountability, transparency, and the role of royal families in modern democratic societies. Margaret had to admit that some of her observations over the years had indeed suggested coordination between royal families that might extend beyond appropriate cultural exchanges. The situation became more urgent when Dr. Richardson shared preliminary findings from her investigation. The journalist had documented patterns of royal family behavior during key political events that suggested synchronized responses to major policy decisions. While Dr. Richardson couldn't interpret the specific communications she had observed, the timing and consistency of royal family actions suggested coordination that went beyond coincidence. Margaret realized that Dr. Richardson's investigation would proceed with or without her cooperation. The journalist had already gathered substantial evidence and was clearly committed to publishing her findings. Margaret had to decide whether she would provide expert context that might lead to more accurate reporting, or whether she would remain silent and allow potentially misleading interpretations of royal family behavior. After weeks of deliberation, Margaret agreed to meet with Dr. Richardson under strict conditions. She would provide general background information about royal communication traditions without revealing specific details about contemporary communications or identifying particular royal family members. Margaret hoped this limited cooperation would help ensure accurate reporting while protecting individual privacy. The meeting with Dr. Richardson revealed the extent of the journalist's investigation. She had assembled photographs, video footage, and eyewitness accounts from dozens of royal events over the past decade. The evidence showed clear patterns of coordinated behavior among European royal families during politically sensitive periods. Dr. Richardson had documented instances where royal families appeared to synchronize their public statements about immigration policies, economic reforms, and international relations. She had identified specific events where royal family members performed similar gestures or actions that suggested they were following coordinated scripts rather than responding independently to political developments. Margaret was struck by the accuracy of Dr. Richardson's observations, even without understanding the specific communication methods involved. The journalist had essentially reverse-engineered the existence of royal coordination through careful analysis of public behavior patterns. Margaret realized that the secret communication systems she had helped preserve and modernize were becoming visible to skilled investigators despite their sophisticated security measures. Dr. Richardson's most damning evidence involved royal family communications during the Brexit referendum period. She had documented what appeared to be coordinated positioning by multiple European royal families that seemed designed to influence public opinion about European Union membership. The communications suggested that royal families were actively working to shape democratic outcomes through subtle but systematic influence campaigns. Margaret found herself in an impossible position as Dr. Richardson presented this evidence. She could confirm that royal families did indeed possess sophisticated communication capabilities that would allow them to coordinate the activities Dr. Richardson had documented. However, providing such confirmation would essentially validate the journalist's most serious allegations about royal family involvement in democratic processes. Margaret chose a middle path that she hoped would serve both truth and discretion. She provided Dr. Richardson with historical context about royal communication traditions while emphasizing that these systems had originally developed for ceremonial and cultural purposes rather than political coordination. Margaret explained that what appeared to be political manipulation might actually be traditional cultural behaviors that had acquired unintended political significance in modern contexts. However, Margaret also acknowledged that the line between cultural tradition and political influence had become increasingly blurred as royal families adapted their communication systems to contemporary challenges. She admitted that her own work had contributed to this blurring by helping royal families maintain communication capabilities that were more sophisticated than anything they had historically possessed. Dr. Richardson's article, published in early 2016, created international controversy about the role of royal families in European politics. The piece detailed the existence of sophisticated royal communication systems without revealing specific methods or identifying Margaret as a primary source. The article raised questions about democratic accountability, royal constitutional roles, and the appropriateness of coordinated royal family activities. The response to Dr. Richardson's revelations varied dramatically across different European nations. Countries with strong democratic traditions demanded investigations into royal family activities and called for increased transparency requirements. Nations with more traditional monarchical systems defended royal families' rights to maintain private communications and cultural heritage. Margaret watched the controversy unfold with mixed emotions. She felt vindicated that serious questions were finally being asked about the intersection of royal communications and democratic governance. However, she also felt guilty about contributing to investigations that were causing distress to royal family members who had trusted her with access to their private traditions. The controversy forced royal families across Europe to reconsider their communication practices. Several royal households announced reviews of their traditional protocols and pledged increased transparency about their public activities. Some royal family members publicly acknowledged that their communication traditions needed to be updated for contemporary democratic expectations. Margaret received numerous requests from royal families asking for her assistance in developing more transparent communication systems. They wanted to maintain cultural traditions while ensuring that their activities couldn't be misinterpreted as inappropriate political coordination. Margaret found herself helping to design the very transparency measures that her previous work had made necessary. The work was challenging because it required balancing competing demands for cultural preservation, family privacy, and democratic accountability. Margaret had to create communication systems that allowed royal families to maintain essential coordination capabilities while ensuring that their activities were visible to appropriate oversight authorities. Margaret's new role involved working with constitutional experts, government officials, and civil rights advocates to develop frameworks for royal communications that served legitimate cultural purposes without undermining democratic processes. The work was more complex than anything Margaret had previously undertaken, as it required reconciling centuries-old traditions with contemporary governance principles. One of Margaret's most significant contributions during this period was helping to establish independent monitoring systems for royal family communications. These systems allowed qualified observers to ensure that royal communications remained within appropriate bounds without violating family privacy or cultural heritage protections. Margaret also worked on developing public education programs that helped citizens understand the difference between legitimate royal cultural activities and potentially inappropriate political coordination. The goal was to create informed public oversight that could distinguish between harmless traditions and problematic influence campaigns. The process of reforming royal communications revealed the complexity of modern monarchical roles in democratic societies. Royal families served important cultural and ceremonial functions that required private coordination capabilities, but they also held significant influence that needed to be exercised responsibly within democratic frameworks. Margaret's experience with this reform process convinced her that royal communication traditions could survive and thrive under increased transparency, but only if royal families were willing to adapt their practices to contemporary expectations. The families that embraced reform and accountability found that they could maintain their cultural heritage while strengthening their relationships with democratic institutions. However, the reform process also revealed that some aspects of traditional royal communications were indeed incompatible with democratic governance. Margaret helped royal families identify and abandon communication practices that created inappropriate political coordination while preserving traditions that served legitimate cultural and ceremonial purposes. By 2018, Margaret had effectively transitioned from being a scholar of secret royal communications to being an advocate for transparent and accountable royal activities. Her work focused on helping royal families navigate the intersection of tradition and democracy in ways that served both cultural preservation and democratic governance. Margaret's final major contribution to royal communication studies was a comprehensive book that documented the historical development of royal communication traditions while explaining how these practices had been reformed for contemporary democratic societies. The book served as both a historical record and a guide for future efforts to balance royal cultural heritage with democratic accountability. Looking back on her career, Margaret realized that her accidental discovery of royal communication systems had led her on a journey that transformed not just her own understanding but the practices of royal families across Europe. Her work had helped preserve important cultural heritage while ensuring that these traditions served democratic rather than autocratic purposes. The silent language of royal families had survived its encounter with modern democratic scrutiny, but it had emerged fundamentally changed. Margaret had played a crucial role in guiding this transformation, helping ancient traditions adapt to contemporary expectations while maintaining their essential cultural significance. Margaret's story demonstrated that cultural preservation and democratic accountability were not necessarily incompatible goals. With careful planning, thoughtful reform, and genuine commitment to both tradition and transparency, it was possible to honor historical heritage while serving contemporary democratic values. The royal families of Europe had learned that their communication traditions could thrive under public scrutiny if they were willing to embrace the principles of openness and accountability that define modern democratic societies. Margaret's work had shown that transparency didn't have to mean the destruction of cultural heritage, but rather its evolution into forms that served contemporary purposes while honoring historical significance. As Margaret concluded her active research career, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with simple observations at a Danish state dinner decades earlier. Her work had evolved from academic curiosity to cultural preservation to active participation in the transformation of ancient traditions for modern democratic purposes. The silent table signals of royal families would continue to evolve, but they would do so under the watchful eyes of democratic institutions committed to ensuring that these ancient traditions served the public good rather than private privilege. Margaret's legacy was helping to ensure that the remarkable heritage of royal communications would survive and thrive in an increasingly transparent and accountable world.